You're listening to the Cow Country Cafe on Beef Team TV. Well, welcome everybody to the Cow Country Cafe. This is kind of our new format for the webinar series that was on Cow Country USA, and we kind of decided that we needed to break this up a little bit, kind of have a new format to follow, because we're probably going to be doing quite a few of these over the next several months. Now, today's topic is looking at finding profit in the cow-calf sector, and I just wanted to point out that this is a seminar that I did for cow-calf days this last January, and that was really before all of this coronavirus business and the subsequent crash in the cattle market happened. So when we're talking about finding profit in the cow-calf sector, what we're really talking about is structurally over the long term, trying to find more profit in the cow-calf sector, and not talking so much about the most current situation that the cattle industry finds itself in. That's a different topic for a different day. What we're going to focus on today is just simply looking at, when you think about bringing more young producers into this business, trying to figure out ways of generating more profit to make this a more attractive industry to young people. Obviously, the cards are really stacked against young folks entering the cow-calf sector because it's such a resource, intensive business. It requires a lot of stuff, really expensive stuff to get started. And so you gotta expect there's going to be a general reluctance on the part of a lot of young folks to enter this business. And if we look at this next slide, kind of where we're going to start here, a lot of it has to do with this, and I'm sure this is not really news to anybody right here, but you can see the estimated average cow-calf returns over cash costs, and this is nationwide, but Minnesota is really not any different, nor is any other state. There's a few years where some profits are pretty good. There's some years you can see in the red where profits are not so good. And everything else over the last, 30, 40 years or so is just pretty marginal profits, somewhere between 50 and 75 bucks on average. And that's kind of where the cow-calf deal is. And if we expect young people to be involved in this business over the long term, we need to talk about structurally ways that we can make this thing more profitable for people, or there just simply aren't going to be a lot of cow-calf people left after this current generation of cow-calf folks retire. And with the current situation, that may be sooner than later. I guess we'll see. But in any event, let's kind of start our discussion here looking at the average annual cow cost, and this is for Minnesota in particular, okay? And you can see that it fluctuates a little bit over the years. 2014, of course, was when we had the really high calf prices, and obviously, the cost of things followed the calf prices up. But incidentally, over the subsequent years, 15, 16, 17, cost of running a cow actually came down a little bit in Minnesota on average. And now 2018 is the latest data that we have. The 2019 data probably will be out here pretty soon. We'll be able to incorporate that. But it looks like, now cow costs are on the rise again. Okay. And so the reason that this is significant is when you look at this situation right here, oftentimes when you look at the current cost of running a cow in Minnesota, and if you looked at a normal, not necessarily the price today here on April the 6th, 2020, but if you look at where we were at, let's just say in the middle of January, we were probably at for wean calves, we were probably around somewhere around $1.55, maybe $1.60. And so at today's current cow cost, it's the break-even sale weight on a calf is it's got to weigh 525 pounds at $1.60 just to break even at that cow cost of, basically $750. All right. And I'm presuming most of us don't just want to break even. We'd like to make a little bit of money. And so the calf's going to have to be that much heavier. And I'm not obviously talking about the individual calf. I'm talking about the average weaning weight for the herd. And as you may or may not remember from previous discussions that we have, if you remember, the average weaning weight, average herd weaning weight in Minnesota is about 535 pounds right now. So, for a lot of us, we're simply just looking at a break-even deal. And these astronomically high calf prices that we had for a few years a while back are obviously not the norm. Where we're at today, or at least where we were at, kind of in January, that's more of the norm. And so we're going to have to look at some different things to structurally figure out, why is this such a low margin deal? Okay, now this next slide, in my mind anyway, really is what explains a lot of it. If we look at pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed, of course, this is our primary measurement of efficiency in the cow-calf deal. And we're simply looking at average weaning weight times weaning percentage. All right, and you can see from 2014 and 2015 were particularly tough years. And this obviously fluctuates a lot with the year. Some years higher weaning weights than others. Some years is a little tougher on weaning percentage. 2016 was a little bit better, but on average we're kind of looking in that 465 to 470 pounds. And if you remember, this is pay weight. This is what you actually get paid for. Even if you have an average weaning weight of 575 or 600, if you lose 15% of your calves, this is the actual pounds that you have to sell on average per cow. And so that's why this becomes such a tremendously important measurement. So previous study that I did a few years back, we looked at the relationship of each of these factors on the left and how they contribute to profitability in the cow-calf sector when you look from outfit to outfit to outfit. Okay, and so a lot of the discussion usually revolves around feed cost. We like to talk about feed cost because it's something we can directly manage. But the reality is that feed is expensive, and it's expensive for everybody. And differences in feed costs really don't contribute that much to differences in profitability. Depreciation, 12%. Now, market price for calves, that contributed about 77% to profitability. So that's pretty high. So what you get for your calves at the end, plays a pretty big factor in profitability. And then obviously pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed, which includes weaning weight and weaning percentage, is by far and away the biggest indicator of profitability in the cow-calf sector. So those are the things that we kind of want to focus on. And this graph right here just kind of shows us that situation. Whereas if you look at feed cost, and what this graph is showing is this is Minnesota data, and we basically took profitability and divided it into the top 30% of most profitable outfits, the middle 30%, and the lowest 30%. And you can see that there are some differences, especially from the top end to the low end. There's some differences in feed costs, but between the top 30% and the middle 30%, we're only looking at about $30 difference in feed cost. And so basically for the top 66% of the cow-calf sector in Minnesota, there's only about a $30 difference in feed cost. And that's really what I'm saying when I say, feed's expensive, and it's expensive for everybody. So it's not that feed costs aren't important. I don't want to leave you with that, thinking that it's not, because it is. It's 70% of the cost of running a cow. But for all the management time that we spend focusing on feeding costs and trying to reduce feeding costs, the reality is there's not that much margin there. You guys are all incredibly intelligent and some of the most innovative people that there are. If there was a way to lower feed costs substantially, we would have figured it out. Now, the individual may have some room to improve in terms of feed costs, but I'm just saying, as a whole cow-calf sector in Minnesota, I don't think there's a lot of extra margin just by focusing on feed costs. And if we reduce the cost of feeding a cow by $30, well, the profitability on that calf increases by $30. If we can improve our weaning percentage by 5%, that's $150 or $200 improved value per calf. So that's maybe the better area to spend some of our management time, is how do we keep more of these calves alive? Okay, and so when you look at it statistically, the biggest inhibitors to profitability in the cow-calf deal in Minnesota are weaning percentage, whole herd efficiency, and marketing, based on what we just looked at. And so those are the things that I really want to focus on most specifically in this presentation, because these are the things you can spend time on that will have the biggest impact on your profitability in the coming years. And some of these issues are structural, meaning we need to really rethink how we do things. And some of them maybe are just a little more management oriented, things we can do right now that can make a pretty significant difference. Okay, so we've talked about average weaning percentage in the these are the averages for Minnesota from 14 to 18. And you can see it fluctuates a lot, but typically we're somewhere around this 85 to 87%. There are some years that are better. 2015 and 16 were up around 90%, but remember, those were really warm, open winters. That's not a typical winter for Minnesota. 17 and 18 were probably a little more typical to what we find in the wintertime in Minnesota, and the weaning percentages show that pretty clearly. So this is kind of where I'm coming from when I start talking about when we look at the weaning percentage and the efficiency of the herd in reproducing. This is really what we're talking about. This has a big impact on basically the pounds of beef that we have to sell at the end of the year. Okay, so what are the issues concerning weaning percentage? You think about the Dakotas, Nebraska, some areas like that. They typically run weaning percentages in the low 90s, and we really struggle to get out of the mid 80s here in Minnesota. Well, I'll tell you, and you guys know this, Minnesota's not a pleasant place in the wintertime. And it's not because it's cold. I mean, it gets cold in the Dakotas. It's not because it's snowy. They get a lot of snow in the Dakotas and Nebraska and so on and so forth. But what they don't have that we do is lots of humidity. We really have a lot of humidity. And if you're a native Minnesotan, you may not really notice that as much as somebody like myself that grew up further west. And that's really, to me, the big difference between these areas is just the humidity that we have. The air is always wet. At some level, every surface is always wet, and that's an optimal place for some of the sickness issues that we see, around calving time. So, without a doubt, scours is probably our biggest barrier to the weaning percentage question. And, on this slide that you're looking at here, most calf death loss post-calving occurs 2 to 30 days or around 3 months of age, which is very indicative of mostly viral scours, but oftentimes a bacterial type infection as well. And so keeping that in mind, I'm not going to go into great detail. We'll do that in another webinar on how to specifically address the scours issue. and I'll probably have Dr. Joe Armstrong help me out with that a little bit. But just thinking structurally, if scours is the main thing, is the main barrier to high weaning percentages in cow calf deals in Minnesota, then we got to start thinking about not only the symptoms and treating health issues and preventing health issues, but I'm really convinced that at some level we need to structurally rethink how we run cows in Minnesota. Spring calving is a really, really tough deal in our environment where the springs are so humid. Even the winter times are relatively humid and creates a lot of problems for us. So we need to start thinking about things like calving dates, calving systems. Think about how we calve cows out in Minnesota. Everything's got to be right up against the barn. Because maybe that's the only water source, or we don't want them somewhere if they need assistance that we got to go out and get them in. Whatever the situation is, our calving system really creates a lot of problems for us, and there, at least traditionally, does not seem to have been much of a push to change that much. And I think now's the time that we really need to start thinking about, okay, how are we going to change this system? Just completely structurally change how we calve out cows in Minnesota to try and address this calf health issue. That all the treatments in the world have been tried, all the treatments in the world have been discussed. It really has not helped that much. And so structurally, I think we need to completely change, what we're doing, and which is going to result in also having to change things like calving dates, cow nutrition, on down the line. Those are the types of things that I think we're going to have to really, take a look at long term structurally to really address this issue for the long term. So, and the other side of that is when we talk about scours and illness and things like that, we're always talking, generally we're always talking about the calves that die from it. And the reality is that the actual death loss from scours or those types of calf illnesses is probably less than 10% of the total number infected. There's some years where it can be higher, but on the average, it's really not that many that die from it. Most of them get sick and get over it. Okay, but the problem is, the ones that did get over it, there's a lot of evidence that shows that non-mortal scour infections or other type of illnesses as a calf can result in reduced weaning weights of 50 to 75 pounds per head. And when you're talking about morbidity rates or, the number of calves that in the herd that got sick and probably got over it, that can be anywhere from 30 to 50%. Well, it can be anywhere from 0 to 50%, but 30 to 50% is not uncommon. And if that's costing us 50 to 75 pounds of weaning weight, half our calves are 50 to 75 pounds lighter at weaning than they could have been. Well, that could be worse than the 10% or less, maybe 5% of calves that we lost. And so, this is much deeper than just calves that die from these issues. The structural problems with these calf illnesses is killing us all the way down the line, all the way from dead calves to reduced weaning weights, so on and so forth. So this is a big issue. If there's one thing you can do on your farm that would make the biggest difference, I would say to the average cow-calf guy, is to address some of these calf health issues. And like I say, that's not just better medicine. It's not better treatment protocols. We've done all that. We've tried all that. It doesn't help that much. It helps some, but not much. This is a structural problem. We need to change how we do things. So, just to sum that up a little bit, thinking about adjusting calving systems, adjusting calving dates, and the associated nutrition issues. And like I say, I'll have a webinar on this a little bit later on that kind of addresses some of these things more specifically. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about whole herd efficiency. And if any of you came to Cow Calf Days a couple years ago, or I guess it was last year, I did a whole seminar on cow herd efficiency. And so the crux of this topic is there's some really good cows in your herd. Most of the cows are somewhere around average in terms of production, and then you've got kind of a tail end that are relatively, basically they're not productive. If they can't, we talked about on the front end, for a calf to cover the cost of running the cow, it's going to have to weigh somewhere around 500 to 525 pounds. And you can see from this chart, well, for the most part, our average weaning weight in Minnesota is right around that break-even point. And so anything that falls under that is a money loser. And so it's not so much that we can change the distribution of these weaning weights. Most of your cows are always going to be around the average. You're going to have a heavy end, and that's the end that we really like to talk about and focus on. But the reality is it's a relatively small number of calves. And then we've got this light end on the left-hand side that are significantly underperforming. The cows are underperforming in terms of producing saleable product. So there's a couple things that we can do about this scenario, and I think this can have a big impact for a lot of guys, is to, number one, we can move the curve forward, which simply means that we can generate a larger average weaning weight for the herd. And we can do that a couple of ways through, selective culling. Obviously, genetics is going to have a big component of that. Management has a huge component of that, especially with this scours and calf illness situation that we just got done talking about. So there's that. We can move the average forward. There's always going to be a heavy end and a light end. We're not going to change that. But we can move that average forward. And then the other thing we can do is if we really start selectively culling these underperforming cows, we can tighten that curve up and squeeze it together so the light end is not so light, and incidentally the heavy end may not be as heavy either, but that's okay. What we're looking for is a more consistent product and more consistent production out of the cows that we elect to keep in our herd. So keeping those two things in mind, I think there's some things that we can do to make our cow herd a lot more efficient than what it maybe is operating right now. All right. So when we look at, what are the things that we really struggle with in terms of maintaining as efficient herd as we possibly can? Okay. Well, this is a survey that was done by the National Animal Health Federal Agency. And it's about 10 years old, but I doubt much has changed. The top 5 reasons that cows are culled. Number 1 is age. Number 2 is open, disposition, bred late, bad udders. Those types of things. Not real surprising, but what was real surprising to me is producing poor calves was cleared down at number 9. Now, I don't know about you guys, but the number one job of a cow, in my mind, is to produce a good calf that you can make some money on. And if she can't do that, I don't know why she's still in the herd. Okay? Now, it's not that age and opens and disposition aren't important and those types of things. They are important to selectively cull for, but we can't, it maybe is a little bit backwards. In my mind, producing poor calves should be number 1. That's the first reason that a cow doesn't stay in the herd, because she may be a good milker, she may have a good bag, she's got good feet, good eyes, everything's good about her, but for whatever reason, she just doesn't produce calves that we can make any money on. And those are the cows that we really need to look at identifying and removing from the herd. So the other side of that is looking at calving distribution. Okay, and when it's really not feasible to say, well, we're just going to calve all our cows in the first 21 days. I mean, that's not realistic. And even 45 days it's a stretch for a lot of outfits, unless you've been working on that for an extended period of time to make that feasible. Most of us that calve for 90 or 120 days are not going to be able to go to 45 days. That's just not reasonable. But when you think about that, having a 90-day or 120-day calving season is not uncommon, especially in our part of the country. Just remember that those calves, if you look down there to the third 21 days and the fourth 21 days, those calves, even if they're good calves, out of good cows, they're going to be 100 to 200 pounds lighter at weaning time than the cows that calved in the first 21 days or the second 21 days. Okay, so, like I say, it's not really feasible to say, well, I'm just going to go to a 45-day calving season to try and squeeze that up unless you're willing to sell a lot of cows, which most of us are not willing to do that, and you really shouldn't be, because that's not healthy for your operation financially, what you're trying to do. But if you are currently at 120 days, could you go down to 90 days? If you're at 90 days, could you go down to 75? I think any outfit could make those jumps fairly easily without a tremendous amount of economic pain. And that's where we kind of start to, if you remember that bell curve that we talked about earlier, that's where we start to narrow that curve, and we get more cows producing calves that are closer to that average, and at the same time, hopefully we're moving that average forward by making those calves more uniform. Okay, so the question always is okay, well, that's fine and grand, but how do you actually identify these cows that are, basically poor producers? And the number one thing, and I know nobody wants to hear it, but the reality is it's got to come from records. And we've got to keep better records and figure out a way that we can easily, figure out and identify these poor producing cows so that we can get rid of them. And then once we do identify them, we've got to be very disciplined on our culling. We need to be looking at maybe even culling the bottom 10 to 15% of producers every year. And that's in addition to the ones you need to get rid of because they're open or they're broken mouth or got bad feed or, whatever the situation is. So we need to be very disciplined in our culling, and we need to be a lot more aggressive in our culling than maybe we traditionally have. And I think you'll see big dividends from doing that. The first time you do it is tough, but once you kind of get in the groove of it, you'll like the results, I guarantee it. And that'll help us tighten up that calving window, and it'll do a lot of things for us. And like I say, I think you'll be really happy with the results. It's not that hard to do, except for the keeping the records part. If you don't currently do that, it can be a little bit of a challenge to get started in that. But there's a lot of resources out there to help you. If you want to get started keeping better records on cow production and things like that, that's not that hard to get into if a person wants to do it. And, ultimately what we're doing here is try to develop some ways to add value to these calves so that, we can market them. We can market more calves at a higher weight at a higher price. That's ultimately what we're trying to do here. So let's talk about that. Let's think about marketing a little bit. And boy, that's really the hang up for a lot of folks. Because we always feel like it's something that we don't really control. And to a large extent, no, we don't individually have a lot of control over that, but there are a lot of things within the marketing realm that we do have a lot of control over, and I typically don't see that being managed very effectively. And I think a lot of it is when you look at, okay, so you think about, well, as a commercial cow-calf producer, who's your customer? Okay, who are you trying to sell these calves to? Well, you're trying to sell them to a feed yard, which ultimately means you're trying to sell them to the buyer for that feed yard. And do you know what that buyer and that feeder is looking for? And what I've realized over the years is what a cow-calf guy thinks a feed yard is looking for and what a feed yard is actually looking for are almost two entirely different things. And I don't know all the reasons that it got to be that way. But that's the reality is when you talk to cow-calf guys and you talk to feeders, they're talking entirely different languages. And I think that's a little bit of the hang up for a lot of cow-calf outfits in particular. So let's talk a little bit about, well, what are feeders looking for? Well, number one, they're looking for lot size. Okay, they need numbers of uniform calves. They need weight uniformity. They need frame size uniformity. Are these calves fleshy or not fleshy enough? Do they have defects like bad eyes or ears or tails or feet? You know, are they weaned, vaccinated, cut? Do you have documentation of that? What color are they? That's going to matter for some feed yards. It's not going to matter for others. What breeds are they? That matters for some and not for others. So all those things kind of play into what type of product that you have to sell, who's looking for that type of product. And I would say the third thing is are the decisions that you're making on your ranch at home compatible with what your customers are looking for? And I would say a lot of the times, no. Those decisions are made independently of what the customer is really looking for. You know, our customer as a cow-calf guy is not necessarily the people that eat the beef. I mean, it is indirectly, but our customer first and foremost is the person that's looking to buy these calves and feed them. And what they're looking at are some of those end product deals that are important to them. And so, yeah, that does impact us indirectly. But even some of these more direct things, like what we just talked about, that we do have an impact on, are probably first and foremost beyond some of these things that we always hear about, like marbling and tenderness and all those things. Yeah, those things are important to somebody else. And we can do what we can to provide them with that. But ultimately, I would say for the most part, it's these 8 things on this slide here is what we get paid for in the cow-calf deal. All right, so as I'm thinking about this whole deal, I'm kind of running a scenario through my head, and I'm like, okay, well, if you think about the average cow-calf guy in Minnesota, how many groups of cattle does that person sell in a year? Not the numbers, but just the groups, okay? And so let's just focus on a 100 cow herd. That's a little bit bigger than the average in Minnesota, but it's pretty close. 70 or 75, I think, is the average for Minnesota. So if we had 100 cows, how many groups do we sell in a year? All right. Well, I came up with 13 without really thinking about it that hard. All right, we've got the heavy market steers, we got the light steers, we got the heavy heifers, the light heifers, we got the peewees, steers and heifers, we got any calves that are marked for coloring, we got any calves that are marked with some type of physical defect, we've got open cows and heifers, we got late breds, we got running age cows that have, some defect, bad udders or feet or whatever, we got old cows, and we got bulls. You could probably come up with more. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, if this is how the deal is shaken out, how are we ever going to sell more than a half a dozen or maybe a dozen head at a time? It's really hard to do. And so we need to think about ways that we can limit the number of groups that we have to sell, get larger lot sizes, and there's a lot of ways that a person can do that. But ultimately, I think the important thing is to recognize that this is an issue for most cow-calf folks in Minnesota, and the reality is in most of the country. But we're talking about Minnesota specifically here. So I think this is a key point for a lot of folks is, what can we do to make these calves more valuable? All right, well, and depending on where you live in Minnesota, this may be a bigger issue for some than others, but it's worth pointing out is, the nipped ears in the picture on the left, why do those calves sell at such a discount? You get up here in the north, we have a lot of those, and they're not worth anything in the sale barn. Further south, you probably don't have to worry about this as much. But the reality is and I don't know what the incidence of this is, but the buyers are afraid that, well, if they nip their ears, their feet might be froze, which is not a huge deal when the calf is 500 pounds. But when it's 1,400 pounds and you've pumped $600 worth of feed into it, now it matters if the feed are going to go bad. And so that's really what they're concerned about. Now, is that 1% of calves that have nipped ears? I don't know. Was that one calf back in 1983 that had frozen feet? I don't know. It doesn't matter. But if this is an issue for you, we've got to figure out some ways to keep this from happening. Or if it does happen, what are our best methodologies of marketing these cattle? Because it's not sending them through the sale barn, I'll tell you that. And I'm sure you know that. And so we need to work around these types of deals. Same thing goes for bad eyes, tails. If you got a calf that's got bad feet, those types of things. We need to find out some alternative ways of marketing these calves. Don't put these in with your good ones. Because I think they do genuinely, even if they sort them off, they lower the value of the good calves. And these individuals really aren't worth anything. I mean, they really sell at a discount at the barn. So, anything we can do to eliminate this issue is going to be positive. All right, so let's just talk about a few things here that I think are some potential solutions to improve marketing. And we've talked about tightening up the calving season. That's going to look differently for different people, but I do genuinely believe that will help. If you can shorten that up a little bit, get more of your cows closer to the average, that's going to pay some dividends. And that might involve adjusting the calving season. It might involve some other things, but I think most people can probably figure out how to do that without inflicting too much pain on themselves. Okay. And then we got to look at some possibilities of, adjusting the calving season and system to reduce health problems, to reduce defects, things we just talked about. I think that can play a big part in this too. We've got to ban these bull calves or get them cut early. All right. Sending bull calves to the sale barn is leaving a lot of money on the table for a lot of folks. And so whatever it takes to get it done, whether you ban them or knife cut them early, even somebody like me, I mean, I'm not real great at math, but I can count to 2. So if you're banding these calves, make sure you've got 2. That's why they like knife cut better. And they'll sometimes, in some situations, they pay a premium for knife cut. Why is that? Because once you slice the sack open, it's a lot easier to count to 2. It appears that a lot of people have a hard time counting to 2 when they're banding. And so make sure you get both of them if you're going to be banding calves at birth or however it is that you're doing it. All right. The pre-wean vaccination programs, I think, is huge. Obviously, some years it pays better than others. The last several years it's been paying very well. And not only doing that, but having it documented. What you did, when you did it, what products you used, so on and so forth. Have those calves weaned. The old 30-day wean is frowned upon a little bit more than maybe what it traditionally has been. They like them 45 days wean now because a lot of these outbreaks are happening. They're starting just as guys are bringing calves in, and they're like, oh, they've been weaned 30 days, and then the guy that buys them ships them to the feed yard, and they all break with something. So they like them 45 days weaned. If you can swing that, that's going to be very positive for you. That was about $15 this last fall. That was a $15 difference, 30 to 45 days. Developing options to hang on to these calves for a time to background them, I think, is a tremendous game changer for a lot of folks. Yes, there's some facilities involved. Yes, there are some finances involved. I think on the grand scheme of things, they're relatively minor issues. At first, they can seem a little daunting, but once you realize what you can do in terms of marketing options, once you can hang on to those calves, it is a game changer for most folks. And you can spend as much money as you want developing a backgrounding facility, but the reality is if you can just come up with an area where you can feed them calves for 60, 90 days, maybe not even that long. I mean, 45, 60, 90 days. Some guys will hang on to them for 120 days. That's probably not necessary, but you can. The options you have for marketing it'll change your life. And so if you don't have that now, think about what it would take to get that done and see what the feasibility is. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. You know, when you take calves into the sale barn, make sure you can document and verify all the health and management protocols for the auctioneer. That's a big, big deal. Consign those calves early if you can. It makes a big difference, I believe, especially if you have calves that aren't black. Be present at the sale to represent your cattle if you can. And, you know, I think that's a big component of that type of deal is you're building a reputation every time you take your cattle into the sale barn. And being there to represent your cattle says a lot about the person that is selling the cattle, and it gives buyers a lot of confidence that they're not just, and I know it's not possible for everybody. We all work other jobs. We all got other things going on. But if there's one thing you can do that can make a huge difference in terms of building your reputation is, number one, bring good cattle to the sale barn. Leave the crap at home and figure something else out. Or bring it at a different time. Or, you know, whatever works for you. And then be there to represent them cattle. I think that's a big deal, you know, especially for the buyers. And then, you know, the last thing there is watch the seasonal trends for each class of cattle and kind of figure out how this fits into your production system. Or maybe you need to change your production system to fit the seasonal trends in certain classes of cattle. I mean, it kind of depends on where you're at now as far as what you should do, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there. So when we look at this graph right here, this is, you know, basically 2005 to 2014, 5 to 6 weight calves. Look at that curve. Now we're just looking at the gray line in the middle. The red lines are some statistical business. We're just concerned about the gray line in the middle. That's the 10-year average. And so, I mean, this is not news to anybody, but obviously as we go along into the late summer, a lot of calves start coming to town, the price starts to sag, okay? And then it starts to pick back up after kind of that big fall run is over. And as we go into the first of the year, those calves are becoming a little more valuable. And I would say you could probably take that curve and shift it about a month to our right. You know, really it seems like middle of November to the first part of December is really when the fall calf run has been coming the last several years. And I don't see that that's probably going to change much. And so now we're seeing that price dip start in October. It kind of goes through November into the first part of December. Then we get to the first year and it starts to pick up again. So if there's options for you, you know, if you typically wean calves in October and take them straight to the sale barn, it might, you know, if you can get out of that groove, that would be very beneficial for you. That might require some backgrounding facilities. It might require you to calve a little later. You know, I don't know. It's going to be different for everybody, but just recognize, you know, October, November, first part of December is not a great time to sell calves. Now, this next chart is same time period. These are 7 and 8 weight calves. So these are, you know, they could be the heavier end of the current calf crop. But mostly these are yearling cattle, and you can see it's a whole different curve on these bigger calves. Now these calves are the most valuable in July, August, and September because they meet a certain market for the feed yards. Feed yards will trip over each other trying to get these calves at the end of summer, you know, and then the price starts to drop off as you get into October, November, and December. Probably November, December, January now, because this is another one you could probably slide a little bit to the right, and that's kind of the way it's been the last several years. But anyway, it meets a certain market for them. So if you've got these type of cattle or can produce these type of cattle, that's kind of when they're looking for them, is at the end of summer. So there's a lot of opportunity there for folks that are kind of set up that way. All right, and this is another thing to think about. This slide is from Dr. Alfredo at the U of M, and he's just looking at differences in sale barns, because there's always a lot of discussion in Minnesota about, well, you know, our sale barns, they don't pay as much for cattle and so on and so forth. Well, if you look at this slide, that's partially true. Light calves, there's a lot of variation between sale barns. So you've got represented in the dots and in the lines here. You've got sale barns from Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota, and you can see that the light calves, there's a lot of variation in the price given. But once they're over about 700 pounds, all sale barns pay about the same. And a lot of it is because that's where the weight converges with the contract price on the Board of Trade. And so everybody kind of knows what those cattle are worth. But light calves, the price can be all over the place. Sometimes it's better in Minnesota than it is in some other places. Sometimes it's not. It just kind of depends on what buyers are looking for, the quality of the cattle that week, so on and so forth. And so the point being is if you have some heavier calves at sale time, you don't need to be shipping them over to Aberdeen, because Aberdeen's going to give you basically the same price as Motley or Bagley or Central or any of the barns here in Minnesota. The lighter calves, well, maybe there's some opportunity if you can swing it to focus on some different sale barns. It just kind of depends on the quality of cattle that week. Okay, and then this is another slide from Alfredo that I think is really useful, is when you think about, hanging on to some calves and trying to project, okay, is this really going to be worth hanging on to these calves in a backgrounding scenario until after the first of the year, getting into spring? Well, he developed this to try and look at what's the price relationship, because we know generally by the time we make this decision, we know what the price of calves are in September. Okay, and what we don't know is the price we can expect to receive when we're looking to sell them in February or March or whenever that is. And so he looked at some data over the last 30 years or so, and figured out that there's a very, very close relationship to the price of calves in September and the price of calves in March. About 96% relationship, which is extremely high. So if calves are $1.50 in September, there's a 96% chance they're going to be right around $1.50 in March too, and that's a huge deal for us in the cow-calf deal, especially if you're planning on backgrounding, in terms of being able to figure out, okay, well, I got a rough idea of what barring a coronavirus or anything like that, I got a pretty good idea what I'm going to get for those calves in March. So now I can lay out, all right, is it really worth backgrounding these calves? And is it going to be more profitable than just selling them off the cow? So keep this graph handy. It's very useful to know that information. All right, and then the last thing here, just to kind of wrap up in terms of this seasonal trend, are cull cows. Cull cows are not a throwaway for the cow-calf deal. I can't stress that enough. Most cow-calf outfits, cull livestock represent 20 to 25% of our annual income. And so if we're just getting rid of cows because they're inconvenient or whatever, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. You're leaving a lot of net income on the table. And you can see from this graph here, there is a definite seasonal pattern to what these cows are worth. They're worth a lot in the summertime because most people don't have cows at that time, and that's when hamburger consumption is the highest, is in the summertime. All right. And generally it kind of peaks around August and then starts to slide into October and November when everybody's preg checking and hauling cull cows to town. So my point is that whether it's just changing when you market those cull cows, or even there's opportunities to feed a little weight on those cows and sell them after the first of the year. It's not that hard to put another $200 bill on a cull cow just by avoiding the fall run, and sometimes, you got to pencil it out, but sometimes even adding a little weight to them can pay some pretty big dividends. So if you can keep those things in mind, in terms of not only the seasonal trends in what cattle, but everything we've talked about here, I think these things can have a tremendous impact on profitability. I wish you good luck. If you got any questions, don't ever hesitate. My contact information is there on the bottom of the slides. Don't ever hesitate to give me a call or an email or whatever. and we can discuss any of those things. Thanks for joining. I wish you all good health and safety.